Hello, everyone, again. I hope you've had a good break. So we're heading off for the next round table of today, which is going to be moderated by Nathalie Bondil. And we'll hand straight over to her once we've sorted out the problems with screen. And we've got Helen Charman with us from the Victoria and Albert Museum by video conference because she couldn't be with us here in Tours today. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much to ICOM and thank you to the chair, Emily, and the whole ICOM France board for this session. Thank you, dear colleagues, for being here for this second roundtable on new museums and new models. And I'm delighted to moderate this. I'm Nathalie Bondil. I lead the museum and exhibitions at the Institut du Monde Arabe. I'm just filling in a little bit because everyone's taking their places right now. And I am delighted to introduce you to this roundtable. We have with us Philippe Brunella, Gautier Verbeke, Adrien Joly, and from London, Helen Charman, who's going to be speaking to us from London. So I think everyone has now taken their seats, and I think that you're ready to go for this second roundtable, which is focused on new models, that this new focus on audiences and museums that are now focused on changing their focuses. And seeing that impact all platforms. We have not only visitors, but users. And we have been seeking to use all of our creativity to develop new models. So this afternoon, for this roundtable, we're going to be thinking about new models inspired by civil society and participation with civil society. How can we develop these citizenship museums? How can we encourage the generalization of culture, mainstreaming of culture, not only on paper, but through partnerships and cooperations? And we will be talking also about the mistakes that we've made, and how we can use them to move forward, how we can convince others and work with others and develop. So in order to present some of these new models, and there are many more which you could share with us as well, what I wanted to do first of all was to invite Philippe Brunella, who is next to me here. Philippe Brunella is the director of Metz Eurométropole Museum and director of the Museum and Archaeology in Metz. He also leads a museum. He is the lead conservator for chief heritage curator, and he is also involved in a number of different associations for conservation. He comes from Metz, so he is from this town, which he knows very well. And we're going to ask him what he did so that his museum, which had 38,000 visitors in 2010 and went up to 70,000 visitors 10 years later. So we've got a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you for this invitation. Dear colleagues, I'm delighted to be here. I don't know if there's any secret to what we've done. What we've tried to do has been everything at our own scale. So thank you very much for inviting a provincial museum which doesn't have the same number of visitors as those people who've spoken this morning and who are going to speak this afternoon. We are a small institution next to the enormous Centre Pompidou Metz. We were opened in 1840. There are about 6,000 meters squared with 46 rooms and a whole number of different themes presented here. Metz has about 220,000 people, with about 1 million people within 40 minutes drive. We are a long way from the big metropolitan areas with populations in the millions. We have a whole number of works, as you can see. Here are some images which give you some perspective on the variety of our collections, and we have about 70 full-time equivalents staff. And we also have a range of trainee curators and also cultural mediators and administrative personnel, of course, so that everything is done appropriately and correctly. I want to provoke you a little bit. What is the priority within the region? Is it about conserving and conservation, or is it about exhibition? So I started in 2011, and we were trying to develop lots of temporary exhibitions. We thought that the model of the major French and international institutions would work in the region. I don't want to go into all the details here, but I ended up with a number of questions. The next picture will show you the increase in terms of visitor numbers, so you can see the different colors here. You've got an exhibition in 2018 here, which generated a high number of visitor numbers, and then in 2019 as well. And then the periods of these exhibitions are in the gray areas. And then in 2009, you can see visitor numbers around 38,000 numbers of visitors. In 2018, 58,000, 2019, 57,000, and 2022, 60,000. But then we stopped doing temporary exhibitions, which cost a lot in terms of time and money. So it's remarkable, really. The other observation I made in 2011 was that out of our 46 rooms, 44 had not been renovated since 1980. And that was a painful observation to make. I realized as well that we were getting projectors, putting projectors in the rooms in order to light the exhibitions, and that's not a good idea. And the next slide is focused on communication, and then we opened up free entry, which was a decision made by 4 of the different political groupings elected to the town hall. The free entry is worth nothing if we don't communicate around it. We really have to mention this and promote this. I think there's a little problem with Zoom. And so the computers are great, but sometimes we can have some problems. So I'm just waiting. Are our friends who are connected remotely, can they hear us? Are they with us now? We're talking about inclusion here, and we are victims of exclusion. Yes, everything's working online. We're fine. So our first observation was that regardless of exhibitions, visitor numbers stayed the same if we're free, if entry is free. The second observation is to do with communication. So you can run the presentation here. Of course, with social media, we can communicate in real time. You can say when it's hot. On the left here, we can invite people to come and cool off in the museum. The next image is that we've had an increase of particular types of visitors. So we have young visitors who are coming as couples. We have first-time visitors. They don't necessarily spend hours and hours in the museum, but they come in and they just experience the museum. Often we have people that would meet, young couples meeting in the museums, and my dream is to see them coming with their children to say, this is where I met my beloved. And so We have sources for identifying audiences, and these are our colleagues who are the security officers. They are always in contact with the visitors. It's not us in our offices or in the reserves or in the laboratories that are in contact with these visitors. And the perspective of visitors is observed by our colleagues, and they can see people that are coming to the museum for the first time by the way in which they behave. Just to tell a little story, when we opened back up after the first lockdown, we were concerned that we wouldn't have enough security officers, and so I made sure that all of the staff was trained for security, including myself, and I required everyone to spend 1 day a week in the museum. And this was really very instructive because what they thought would be the masterpiece that would fascinate visitors, generally people walk right past it. Next slide. So we communicate about everything that's happening in the museum. We try to do restoration in situ. Even when we have a modest acquisition, we talk a lot about it, and we are progressively changing the scenography in the different rooms, and we're working on the museography. We used to have rooms with poor lighting, with no information plates. We've put color in. We've talked about this morning, and I won't talk about it much. We've also changed the lighting. There's a sound problem on Zoom, which means we're not able to give you the translation right now. It should be back any moment. And the system works very well. We have worked on changing atmospheres. We also repair the lighting. We're using LED lights. At the beginning, we struggled to find the right light bulbs with the right color lighting, and now we have a team member who is repairing systems for lighting systems and repairing these new lighting systems. He's been able to repair about 65 each of these, and each of these cost 350, 400 euros. So that's not bad what he's managed to do. All of our information plates are in 3 languages, French, German, and English. We have put in place a whole range of exhibitions outside the museum. I'd just like to suggest that instead of focusing in on our own museum, what we decided to do is to work with cultural mediators and then go somewhere else to win over new audiences. We did an exhibition here in the Palais de Justice, in the city court, and to talk about currency and coins in that context via an exhibition. And then we no longer have a kind of policy focused on major exhibitions with catalogs and bibliographies which improve the CVs of all my colleagues, but we've created 2 collections. One collection is about the memory of reserves, because now we're working on our own collections. We've got things to say and to write about our collections. And then there is the Treasures of the Reserves collection, which is a form of revision which is accessible to a whole, as many people as possible, focused on our collections. And then we've also developed some booklets that are easy to read and understand, Falk. And if you have information plates that are written by different people, we always test them, and our audience department tests them for their readability. Final slide. We don't rent out areas, general outside areas of the museum, but we rent out for different events rooms within the museum. This is difficult for me as a director, having people eating inside the museum. I remember having 4 people meeting for lunch in one of the rooms, and this was something of a challenge for me to accept. But this opening up to people from outside enables us to have people in many different places. We now face different challenges. I've heard since this morning people talking about art, but there's not only art in museums, there's also works from archaeology, from a whole number of other areas. We have less people asking for external loans, which means that there's less traveling to prospect loans outside the museum. And the scientific team has a lot more involvement, a lot more focus on the refreshment of our collections. We still have another 2,000 square meters available to make available to our users, and we intend to extend the museum. The technical team needs to think about recycling, reuse, and energy, and also handling for private rentals. The administrative team has a lot more public contracts to handle, and we are all focused on security.
Thank you so much, Philippe. It is really remarkable, the vision that you have as a manager, but also a citizen, carrying sustainability at all levels in museum management, in terms of the content and the container itself. It's really remarkable that the work you've been doing over the past 10 years. Talking about mediation now, I'm going to move on to Gautier Verbeke, who worked for a long time at the Louvre and very recently has been Director of Outreach and Audience Development at the Musée du Louvre. So Gautier Verbeke wants to create a museum laboratory. We're going to be asking him about this. He is a contemporary art historian. Previously, he worked at the Lille Museum of Fine Arts, which we heard about this morning, and was a lecturer. He did not have the training of cultural mediator at the time. It's important because these are notions that we use a lot, and they're quite recent. Another interesting fact is that Gautier worked for a long time in the private sector at the FNAC, which allowed him to observe members of the public. This experience that he has had with customers in the past has been very useful. He then worked to become a curator as assistant and then a mediator before becoming director of outreach and mediation, with a huge number of innovations to his name in terms of the meaning of museum, rewriting some of the information, with a great opening towards a real openness towards citizens. So all of this to say congratulations, and we're really looking forward to hearing your perspective. Thank you very much, Nathalie. Thank you, ICOM France, for inviting me. I'm going to be talking today about our long experience at the Louvre Lens. and my new experience at the Louvre in Paris, with a number of different operations, actions, and tests that we've carried out. So mediation is a new field of experimentation. It's a real up-and-coming discipline. It's relatively new, relatively recent. We've been talking about mediation only in very recent years, and it has really an exponential number of disciplines incorporated within the notion itself. So I'd like to talk first of all about Lens. The Louvre Lens is quite a recent museum. It celebrated its 10th anniversary last year. The aim was to be working in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, northeastern France region. There was an economic and social crisis in this area, a health crisis as well. All of the indicators are red in this territory. The aim was to create momentum in this territory by opening a museum. This was a real big responsibility for a cultural institution, and we needed to capitalize on that. We needed to breathe life into that, and it took a few years before we were able to see it come into being. Louvre Lens last year welcomed 550,000 odd visitors. Around 70% of them were from the northeastern France region, with a lot of inhabitants. We saw that if all of the inhabitants had come to the museum, if it was only the local inhabitants that had visited, they'd have had to have come 8 times to make up these numbers. We went to find these people, like we heard in the previous presentation. We opened up free access to the permanent collection, but also I'm going to set out some other actions that we've done. I'm talking about Lens because all museums have their own problems depending on their territory, the nature of their collections, and this is perfectly normal. It also depends on how old the institution is. It depends on the capacity of its teams. A lot of museums do not have very large teams in order to carry out this kind of operation. In the next slide, I would like to come back to the profession. The professions of mediation. We've been talking about cultural mediation since this morning, but what does a mediator actually do? They need to be able to pass on historical information, artistic, scientific information, etc. They also need to be able to listen above all, to adopt a posture of humility, welcome foreign tourists as well, somebody with disabilities, the entire spectrum of visitors and target audience that a museum has within its audience strategy. They also need to work with scientists. This issue of posture is very important. In fields that are not first and foremost cultural. This is everything I wanted to say about the first slide. Let's move on to the next one. A proposal that I thought would be interesting to discuss would be spaces and territories, because museum mediation is also about that. It's about asking the question of the natural basin of a museum. Who is a museum addressed to? Who are we working with? In Lens, I've talked about this a little bit. There was this mining population that we needed to win over, that we needed to help take ownership of this new museum and this new museal tool that had been made available to them. The problem in Paris is different. With COVID, people living in and around Paris came back to the museums after the pandemic, and they were able to take back ownership of these museums that had been taken over by mass tourism. the question now is how we can continue to promote this natural visitor base for the Louvre Museum, where foreign tourists are coming back. The question of spaces is also raised within the museum itself. We talked about it briefly this morning, for there to be spaces dedicated to the members of the public within the museum itself. You can see some examples here about rooms for families, but there are also spaces outside of the museum. And this links in with what we just heard in the previous presentation. In Lens, we have used the park around the museum, proposing free holidays to some of our neighbors who did not have enough money to be able to go on holiday. Let's move on to the next slide now, where other spaces are investigated. We worked a lot around the notion of bodies and health with the Club de Lens, so the football club in Lens. We've worked a lot with this football club. On the top right, you can see a gallery inside the football stadium with local artists who supported us in order to infuse the presence of this museum quite naturally into the lives of local residents. We're trying to see how we can make the museum an active player, a participant, a driving force within a territory. When we started this museum, there was a real pilgrimage, cultural pilgrimage across different parts of Lens. In the past 10 years, we've had a partnership in the hospital as well, which has been really exemplary in Paris as well with the Louvre Museum. You can see this Egyptian bust. For months, the mediation team went to meet all residents across an entire French department, right into rural areas that were very difficult to reach. This is one of the important things that mediators need to be doing nowadays. We're thinking about what we're presenting within our museum itself, what its architecture is, what its professions are. And I'm really going to insist on this point because there's a real appetite amongst members of the public to meet professionals, to be in contact with them. And how is this benefiting current society? We know that we live in a period in recent years that's been quite challenging. There have been health crises, social crises. There's a kind of fragmentation of society, which appears to be getting worse over time. And we need to be asking the question today, as a public service, as a public cultural service, what can a museum provide as a response? How can a museum start to repair this kind of thing? That's what we were saying this morning, disruptive approaches, as you can see behind me. So, for example, we can authorize a bit of fun in museums. We can organize superhero weekends or cosplay weekends, and you'll be surprised to see hundreds of people showing up, dressed up in your museum, because they're just waiting for opportunities like that. Jay-Z and Beyonce, we've opened up our exhibition for them. That was a massive cloud, obviously. And also welcoming people through Roman carnivals with families coming in for exhibition openings, and social centers that are going to create busts of people dressed up as Romans, for instance, in order to celebrate the launch of an exhibition. There's disruptive formats such as Egyptian discos. I showed you a photo here at the top. This is a kind of club night version of the Department of Egyptian Antiquities. There are also digital solutions. I do not believe that they cannot exist when disconnected from human mediation. That's why I've chosen this illustration. If you can please pass on to the next slide. And then I've also talked about approaches through sport, through movement, we can go to these different areas in order to build encounters with different people. We're leaving people opportunities and space to learn their own lessons. We're leaving space for the public to express themselves. We're allowing members of the public to get involved in mediation. Sometimes these people are capable of expressing relevant things about a work of art. Let me give you an example of some car mechanics who wanted to work, and they were able to recreate some works of art with their own interpretation and spin on it in the museum park. Let's move forward now on the question of different forms of participation. There's a question of power, and I agree with what we heard this morning from Bruno Girvaud. There's an absolute experience of creating a fully participatory exhibition from its curatorship, setup, media coverage, etc. We worked with 100 young people, the entire museum team, and even in quite a young organization where the teams are very motivated about connection with members of the public, it does raise some problems because the time scale, the immediate nature of mediation is not the same as exhibitions, conservation, and all of the technical teams which have a longer preparation time frame. So we needed to manage some of the frustration and incidents that could arise from this. But this experience was a success in the museum, and we were able to grow from this and from this experience. The public is very keen to come in and feed in their own experience. Here you can see an experiment that we had with the CNRS. The public likes to take part in the life of the institution by showing what they like in a work of art. This can help us change our perspective. We do not know what people are actually looking at in a work, and this can really help us in that sense. We can learn that a group will not necessarily look at an object the same way that an individual does, and that it can be a gendered response as well, that women do not necessarily see works of art the same way that men do, and we can learn a lot of lessons. This is now the final slide. So allow me to wrap up by talking about the question of the responsibilities of museums nowadays. Once again, in order to go back to what I was saying previously, the context in which we are living raises a number of questions. Society is changing very quickly, and it raises a lot of questions about the origins of collections, the representation of women or the absence of female artists, the absence of representation of people from different origins within the collections. Nowadays, we need museums and cultural mediation to be equipped in order to respond to that in an intelligent way so that we can answer the public's questions correctly. Our responsibilities come up increasingly among members of the public, and as professionals of mediation, we need the input of scientists, collection managers in order to help us to respond to these kinds of questions. Let me come back to the reparation missions by museums. I believe that there's a utility within how people read and understand the objects, the shared story and history that they're able to communicate. It's a kind of cement within society. I believe there's a way of apprehending or building tolerance in order to realize the consistency that there has been throughout that. All of this is managed by mediation in contact with members of the public. And I believe that they're going to be really important issues in the future with regard to the kinds of things that museums will be up against. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gautier. Yes, this decentralized perspective with nomad museums that go out beyond the institution, even if they're very prestigious, that's really what we're going to be very focused in on later on. How can we bring people who are so different, groups of people that are so difficult to cohabit together? So for the next session, it's Helen Charman, who will be joining us from London. Helen Charman is the Director of Education National Programmes and the Young V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Are you with us? Good afternoon, Helen.
I am with you, and I'm hoping to see my slides. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
We can hear you perfectly. I'm going to introduce you and then I'll hand over to you.
Merveilleux.
So Helen has a very interesting background because she had a master's in art history and then a BA in English literature and then a diploma in museum administration. But in addition to all of that, she has a PhD in education, in addition to a master's in art history. And I think that this PhD in museum education from the University of London is something that's really very rare. And so having this PhD, her PhD was focused on design, exhibition design. So this morning we talked about design syncing. Valerie Guillaume talked about design syncing. So there's this question about how we can think about museums and how can it be focused on people? How can we connect it in with the architecture and the scenography of museums? Today, Helen directs the Young V&A programs, and this is a new area that has opened. We're looking forward to seeing it. And I should say that her role covers responsibility for learning, for interpretation of the V&A Academy, as well as national programs. At an international level, Helen Charman is also works in with the UNESCO Framework for Culture and Arts Education and is a member of the advisory board of the Association of Children's Museums and the scientific committee of the Global Forum on Inclusive Education. So, we are now going to see how Helen, with the support of Tristram Hunt, who was her predecessor in this famous museum, and how she's developed Young V&A. Thank you. Over to you, Helen.
Okay, thank you. And very warm greetings from a beautiful, sunny London. Just to say, actually, Tristram Hunt is still director overall of the V&A Museum. You would think I was being very cheeky to be introduced as that director, but I am director of Young V&A, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon. Okay, I think you're driving the slides, so could I have the next slide, please? Oh, okay, no, I think I can do it. No, I think you'll need to do it. Oh, okay. Okay, just for some context, the Victoria and Albert Museum, we are a national museum. We have a collection of 2.8 million objects, and our driving mission is to promote the value of design and creativity in all its forms for everyone. And we have a particular focus now in our strategic objectives on expanding the role of the museum in the 21st century and developing our audiences. So this very much aligns, obviously, with the theme of the conference. Next slide, please. Again, just for context, those 2.8 million objects are divided across collections, as you see here: art, architecture, photography and design, collections care and access. You can imagine there's a lot of that. Decorative art and sculpture, performance, furniture, textiles and fashion. And then we have the National Art Library, archives, and a very strong research institute. So as an educator in museums, it's an extraordinary wealth of material culture to work with. But of course, museums are for people. They might be about objects, about stories, but they are for people. And a museum without an audience is not a museum. So I tend to think that I've got the best job in the world, certainly at the V&A, in that my job is absolutely focusing on our audiences and in particular on our learners. Next slide, please. So I won't go through all of this, just want you to look at the central objective. These are our 5 strategic objectives of the whole of the V&A. And the central one here, to inspire creativity, creative confidence in all our audiences, and to champion the skills needed to drive the future of the creative economy. So everything that we do in my division is all about driving forward the vital importance of creativity as a skill for all our learners, but let's say particularly for young people today, and all the skills of problem solving and collaboration, communication, critical thinking, contextual knowledge, content knowledge, that all sit within what we call creativity. Next slide, please. So the V&A has several sites, and so we are undergoing a period of expansion. We have the mothership in South Kensington, where we have been since 1852, with our origins in the Great Exhibition of 1851. And then 5 years ago, we opened V&A Dundee in Scotland. We also have a partnership with V&A Wedgwood, which is in Stoke in the Midlands in England. And then on July the 1st this year, we opened Young V&A, a museum of creativity, which we designed with and for children. And we designed it with children age 8 to 12, but the museum is for children from birth to 14. And that's the museum that I'm a director of. And then we have, opening in 2025, V&A East Storehouse, a public access store for our massive collection, and then V&A East Museum. And those are part of the Legacy project from the 2012 Olympics, and those are in London. So in London, we will have 4 physical sites, and then of course we have our online V&A. Next slide, please. So with such a huge museum and a very large number of learners coming through, we have, before COVID, we had about 900,000 learners coming through the programs. So, you know, nearly 1 million learners a year. That's amazing. So what an opportunity to promote creativity. So underpinning the way that we work is this model which I developed through my studies and through working with my teams of designerly learning. Just very quickly, this means that we work in 3 distinctive ways. We are user or learner centered. Yes, the objects are there to catalyze creative engagement, but we focus on the learner. The learner is at the core. We are outward facing. We connect with the real world contexts of our learners. And this makes our learning programs meaningful and relevant and inspiring. And also we work as designers do, in a way that is experimental and iterative. We are constantly learning. And of course, you know, the role of evaluation is very important in that. But we call this process designerly learning, and it underpins everything that we do. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's pull focus now to Young V&A. It's an amazing museum, and you all must come next time that you're in London. Please come. We're in East London, and we opened on the 1st of July, and it's been absolutely mad since then. Very popular. So it's the UK's first free national museum. Thank you. National Museum of Art, Design and Performance, designed with and for children and young people. And of course, the with is really important. Co-design at the heart. It was a 13 million capital project, a refurbishment of an existing building that the V&A owned in the east of London. And it's all about driving forward creativity in childhood. And everything in Young V&A is underpinned by theories of childhood development. So we've had to learn a lot, develop our museum knowledge as professionals into new spheres. And you can see here, this is part of our opening festival. And in fact, you might just be able to see those are hula hoop dancers. We had, well, you name it, we had it, hip hop dancers, orchestras, massive puppets. You know, there was a lot going on. Next slide, please. Okay, very quickly, I talked about designerly learning and the importance of context. So I won't go into all of these, but you know, globally, we know that creativity is a life skill. It is essential now, not just to thrive, but to survive, to problem solve. How do we create and think our way and problem solve out of the next wicked problem, whether that's a pandemic or you know whatever it might be? The UN Sustainable Development Goals promote creativity. We're dealing with all of these developments in technology, of course, AI, the metaverse, and most of all, the climate crisis, which looms large for all of us. And my goodness me, we're going to need to do some creative thinking to work our way through that one. So big global context for our work. And then nationally, in England, we have had over the last 12 years or so, we've seen a steady decline in take up in schools for creative subjects, and in particular, design and technology. So at the V&A, as a museum of applied creativity, we know that we have a really important role to play nationally to promote the value of creativity and design. Now, this is interesting. We did a survey before we, as part of our research, it was a 6-year project to develop Young V&A. So we surveyed 8 to 12-year-olds and we asked them, what do you think when we say museum? And well, 40%, so 4 out of 10 children said boring. So they don't think that museums are for them. And why should they? Because frankly, museums are not really designed for children or with children. So we've got quite a lot of learning to do if we want our material culture and our heritage to be inspiring and joyful for our youngest visitors. And then the local context for Young V&A, we are in the poorest borough in the whole of the country. Young V&A is in the borough with the highest level of childhood poverty and deprivation. So there is nowhere better than Tower Hamlets, east of London, for us to create and open this museum. But it's also a borough that's growing quickly. It has a young population and there's an enormous amount of economic activity and potential. Next slide, please. Okay, so 2 ideas to hold on to as we do a whiz through Young V&A. The first one, creative confidence at the heart of the project. The ability to make connections between ideas, to generate one's own ideas, to problem solve, to bring ideas to life, and to affect change for good through creativity. This is our definition. And then co-working, co-design, co-production, co-curation has informed our building, our gallery content, and our programs. And actually, we worked with over 22,000 children, young people, families, educators, over the course of the project to help develop the Young V&A. Next slide, please. Okay, again, I won't read all of this, but these are our 4 aims: inspiring children with their own creativity and creative agency, empowering our educators to really value and drive forward creative education, connecting children and young people with designers, innovators, entrepreneurs, and most importantly, with each other. And then perhaps most relevant for this wonderful conference, influencing the sector in inclusive museum practice. Our sector has a lot to learn about how to create museum environments that genuinely meet the needs and interests and aspirations and dreams of children and young people. Next slide, please. Okay, and then we are a local museum. We also have a national remit, and then also we've been doing quite a lot actually internationally. It's really exciting. There's a huge amount of interest across our sector in developing new creative and cultural spaces for children, and we want to really be part of that conversation. Next slide, please. Okay, so co-design, we define that as the practice by which users become active, creative participants in the design process. Co-design is about designing with and not for. So avec et par pour. My French is no good, sorry. And so 3 areas of co-design, and that's co-design, co-curation, and also co-production of content on the galleries. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've just got 3 slides to give you some insight into our gorgeous galleries. So there are 3 permanent galleries. One is called Play, one is called Imagine, and one is called Design. In the Play gallery, we have this area we call the Mini Museum, and this is for children under 3, and it's curated around sound, colour and texture. And we have world-class objects, amazing museum objects in museum conditions, but they are displayed in ways that appeal to children. So children learn, we learn through experience, we learn through our senses in active ways. And so the objects are set in landscapes that reflect, for example, the texture. So you might have an incredible marble bust that is set in a little landscape of marble, so the child can make the connection between looking and sensing. Or a lovely Red or Dead twig bag that is in a sort of rough textured wooden environment. It's a very active space. You can just see here these beautiful colour totems with an amazing array of incredible objects in them. And the children, we see them absolutely engaging in the way that we design the space. They're looking, they're pointing, they're talking. We have children taking their first steps in this space. It's very, very exciting. We do work with sound. We're developing gross and fine motor skills, communication skills, recognition skills. Everything is underpinned by childhood development theory, working with experts internationally, but most importantly, putting the child's perspective at the centre. So once we knew that we were curating around sound, colour, texture, our brilliant curators could then go into the stores to look for objects that are red, objects that are green. And it sounds reductive, but it isn't, because it's in the framework of how the child is learning and engages with the world. It gives the child order, systemic order with which to engage with the objects. And I can tell you, it works. And it's amazing when you see, a 1-year-old crawling and looking and pointing and babbling and the excitement and in the space. It's amazing, actually. It's really, really exciting. Next slide, please. So in the Imagine Gallery, this is all about storytelling, objects from our theatre and performance collection. There's a lovely stage in the centre for children to both learn technical skills of production and write their own plays and perform them. The skills here, creative listening, speaking and listening, oracy, communication. And again, all of the galleries have interactives which prompt looking and responding, but the interactives aren't screens. Children have enough screen time in their lives. The interactives are designed around embodied physical engagement, which then translates into them engaging with the objects. And of course, then there's all the relevant theories from childhood development that underpin each of the galleries. So the Imagine Gallery is very much about using objects to tell stories, which of course is what curators do. Next slide, please. Okay, and then upstairs, you go up to the design gallery, and here we say to the children, step into the shoes of a designer, think like a designer, be a problem solver. We have an amazing space called the Factory, which illustrates every possible design process you could think of, illustrated through objects. We have what we call the Shed, which is a residency space. At the moment, we have a fantastic fashion accessory designer who her studio is in the gallery, in the museum. And of course, for children, they've never had that opportunity to be inside a designer's studio and respond to a design brief. And then there are a series of design case studies, which all talk about design as an agent for change. There's a lot around sustainability, transport, learning, technology, but again, all with the child's perspective. And throughout the museum, where there are films and interactives, it's the children who have worked with the producers to interview the artists. So again, child's voice, child's perspective, joy. The last co-design workshop we did with the children working with the architects, they said to us, we want the most joyful museum in the world. So we said, okay, that sounds like a really good design brief for a museum. So when you come, you'll see the museum is full of light and colour and energy, and the children are exuberant. They arrive and they see this amazing kaleidoscopic staircase that was designed by the children with the architects, and they see an amazing electric car that's suspended as if it's flying down into the central space. And there's an invitation immediately for the children to engage on their own terms. And there's a lot of energy and learning through play across the museum. I think I'm nearly at the end of my slides. Next slide, please. I'm nearly there. Okay, so just to say, it works since opening. So we had a summer festival, 19,000 engagements. We thought we would get 7,000. So, and that was ambitious, but we got 19,000. We've had, well, now we've had 200,000 visitors in 10 weeks. It's been really busy. 46 people per square metre, but not at the same time. We've exceeded all the targets. It's been amazing, but also it's been quite poignant because it just shows, certainly in England, that we don't have enough of these spaces and that museums need to do more and try harder and do things differently to engage children if we really care about them. And the next slide is my last slide. Okay, so looking ahead, our school visits start next week, which is very exciting. We've got a dedicated suite of 3 lovely studios for the workshops, but also we do a lot on gallery. We open our first exhibition on the 14th of October, Myth to Manga, from our Asia department. Again, a very interactive, joyful, play-led exhibition. We do a lot of work around differently abled and special educational needs that's embedded across the whole museum. So we're in our 2nd year of a big programme there. And then, of course, we do a lot for families and community. But we're learning. We've only been open for 9 weeks, 9.5 weeks. But it's really interesting to see how museum practices are developing to respond to the particular ways this active sensory play-led learning, and still have world-class, amazing museum objects and commissions at the core. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. After this impressive project, we don't have the same resources, but we're going to head over to Adrien Joly, who is the development director at the Mucem Museum in Marseille. He will be speaking about a disruptive experience. So let me tell you a bit about his career, his background. He trained as a historian in both art and culture. He worked in the UK for 10 years at the Royal Pavilion. And he was in charge of audiences at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. In the UK, as you can see, there is an audience experience that is very important. Adrien then joined the sponsorship team at the Château de Versailles with Jean-Jacques Ayagon in 2009, and then in 2012 he took part in the prefiguration of the Mucem as Deputy Communications Officer in charge of sponsorship. Since 2015 he has been head of the Resources Development Department, which focuses on the museum's own resources activities. And it is within this context that he's been working with Jean-François Chunier to manage the Mucem Plus program, which is the first entirely digital subscription model. This is an incredibly disruptive solution. Over to you, Adrien. Good afternoon, everybody. I am delighted to be here today. This is a tool that we have just released and offered to the public. This is the first fully digital monthly subscription program that uses contactless technology in order to enter. So to illustrate this, let me start by showing you a short video. It's very short. Hopefully this will be able to show you what it is. Unlimited exhibitions. Free cinema. Excellent evening event ideas. Discounts at the bookshop. Audio guides at the touch of a button. All of our program right in your pocket. Share your subscription with your family or friends. Mucem Plus is more than just a subscription. For one person, 2 people, or 4 people. Sign up now. So I'm going to go back over this now in a little bit more detail. I know that you're starting to get a bit tired this afternoon. We're on the 4th presentation now. So first of all, let me tell you a bit about the background, where the project came from. This was an idea that we developed during the first lockdown. We made the most of the downtime in order to come up with something new. We were fearful that our own resources, our income was going to be dropping significantly. We were uncertain of what tomorrow would look like. So we're thinking about what we could do if our income started to decline. I summarized everything that I'd seen. I was in constant communication with Rémi Victor Jacques, my deputy. Nathalie knows Jean-Sébastien Bélanger very well, and he created an incredible membership system at a museum in Montreal. It was really exceptional in terms of income stability. I also saw what was happening with Spotify and Netflix, and I saw that life was moving forward very quickly, whereas at museums, we still had this system where people would queue up at a ticket counter in order to buy a ticket. I thought about what the ideal solution could be. Faced with all these constraints, we designed a note, which we were then able to send out. Jean-François Chunier, our president at the time, gave us the green light for this. In the grey section, you can see on the screen, which was research, where we had to kind of compare this with reality. We had to go back to our project and rework it. There are a lot of different administrative and legal barriers that we needed to overcome. By conducting research with widespread prospecting, we were meeting with a number of different companies. For the past few years, we had already had the advantage of working a lot with French tech, and we were aware of the latest innovations. And that's when we were able to draft a public procurement process. And a Toulousan startup responded to our call for tender, which came up with a really complex solution. There were two main innovations with monthly micropayments. Mucem is, administratively speaking, a public institution, so we needed to find a stable administrative financial solution in terms of how individuals could pay us, and an e-badge that's integrated into the smartphone. We thought this was quite interesting. We didn't want to put everything in a QR code. We wanted it to be secure, that people couldn't screenshot in order to obtain access. So the e-badge is integrated into the smartphone itself. If you want to share your subscription with someone, you have to actually give them your mobile phone, which is not something that we do very often because we're all augmented humans now, completely dependent on our smartphones. Anybody who says otherwise, I invite you to give me your mobile phone now, I'll give it back to you tomorrow. So if we move on to the next slide now, you can see that we wanted this to be, once again, the current economy is like this. It needs to be very attractive. If Netflix said you've got to subscribe in January and you're going to pay 130 euros, a communication like this isn't going to work. By having monthly payments, it may seem silly, but it really facilitates the marketing of this program. So we have models with a very wide benchmark. We thought this was the most effective. We didn't want it to be called like couple or family. We've called it solo, duo, and quattro. And there's also a discount for young people and students. The purchasing stream as well, once you've decided to subscribe, it's transformed, it's converted in less than 20 seconds. So when you take your phone and download the app, we need it to be incredibly fluid. And it can be, the monthly payments can be set up with Apple Pay or Google Pay in order to respond to the usage of current users with compulsive buying. The idea, very quickly, we have around 1 million or so visitors every year, around 500,000 in exhibitions, and we have a category of visitors which is significant. We call them the remnant. They're coming back a lot, so it's around 60,000 people. The aim is to convert these people to avoid them having to buy a ticket each time, get them subscribed so that we have a direct contact with them. It's interesting to have an application for them so that they could have all of the information with a simple menu. It's a platformization of museums' offer. We've just added buttons. All this information is available on our website, but good luck trying to find this on our website. It's completely unreadable. The general public finds it really difficult to navigate. So here we have something that is suitable, which is adapted to the general public with easy buttons. I think earlier you were talking, I had a survey with the security guard, and I asked them what people ask them the most often, and we were able to use that feedback in order to create this menu here, which is what to do, what to see. We're able to work with our recurring public in order to invest in a communication plan for audience that we've already successfully conquered in a way, so that we can keep them up to date. We're going to use those resources to communicate to new audiences that have never come before. The idea is to ensure loyalty with the audience that has already been, and to try and communicate to those that don't know us yet. This is the virtual badge. This was the idea that we really liked. It took us a lot of time. We met with a lot of different people that weren't working together. A Toulouse-based startup working with mountain climbing companies and associations, etc. So it was quite difficult to get them into an administrative concept. So this is an RFID technology so that you can tap in and out. We wanted to understand the data and be able to feed that back so that we could understand who's coming, if they're coming once, twice, 3 times, etc. So that in the long term, we can adapt our communication and send the right messages to the right people at the right time. So there are 3 menus. So there's what to do, bottom left, e-badge. And this means that you can tap in and out. As you saw in the video, there are readers at the front of every single exhibition in the museum now. Since June, we've had a lot of tests. We've corrected a lot of bugs as well. Any messages that aren't clear can put visitors off, and we need to make sure that visitors are fully independent with the use of their application. So the Mucem Plus ambassadors, these solo, duo, quattro users, we have around 300 users. We started this in June. We're trialing it at the moment. We have understood that it's the duo card that people often use. It's interesting that we heard about this conviviality that we spoke about this morning, people looking for a sociable experience at the museum. A lot of people said that there's going to be a cannibalism effect where these are going to take away from traditional one-off tickets. And I saw studies in the US where they showed that subscribers, on the contrary, tended to bring other people to the museum, where actually we saw a boost to traditional ticket sales. We only have 300 subscribers, so it's difficult to assess at the moment. The other risk, as I'm sure you've understood, is that €3 a month, you can subscribe and unsubscribe, and the ticket is €12 if you're buying the ticket on the day. So I'm sure people are clever that will be signing up and unsubscribing the same day. Why not? But we realized that we have a lot of tourists in the summer. Only about 5% of people who subscribed chose to unsubscribe and resubscribe. Generally, people stay subscribed. So we're trying to build a special bond with this Mucem Plus community. through push notifications. That was the last slide. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adrien. And in order to wrap up this presentation, I thought that it would also be useful to talk about notions of caring museums, which are really taking off at the moment with these new democratic, philosophical, and ethical models, which we talked about this morning. We're going to go quite quickly because I would like to leave some time for Q&A afterwards. So care or cure, can you understand the difference between this notion of care that we talk about a lot and cure? So these are new practices that we're implementing at the moment. There are a lot of actions in museums, a lot of initiatives that you've been able to see in the media. Was it museotherapy, which was on the front page of the Oeil magazine, or different actions by our colleagues. So let me mention the Fine Arts Museum in Orléans, who are here today. They've been reworking the museum space very disruptively here as a space for blood donation in the city of Orléans, and this is carried out once a month. All of the actions that you carry out, that we carry out, are moving towards this new museum definition, which you all know off by heart now. Let me go back to Hamo, which has just opened at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. This is for mental health, developed with an architect and interior designer who's worked in the medical field, and also a number of initiatives that have been carried out over a number of years now. So, for example, there is the Museum of Art and History in Dreux, which has been working over the past 10 years, since 2010, with the hospital, particularly for artistic mediation outside of the museum in order to promote the mental health of its patients. And they've just celebrated this partnership, which has been carried out now for the past 10 years. This is a remarkable partnership, and there are a number of others that many museums are implementing. To give you some guides now that could be useful, all of this reflection on the impact of museums and society, this comes from the recommendation of ICOM from 2015. This then led to the creation of a guide created in partnership with the OECD in 2018, which shows how museums can also contribute to the emotional well-being of its population. The word care is not used here. Before the pandemic, even, there was this desire that had been clearly expressed. We've been talking increasingly about the caring museum, and this notion comes from the American pioneers and their notion of care. It talks about this desire to have an ethics of care within a society where care is not dedicated to the private sector, where it's not relegated to people who are invisible in the background. It's societies that want to promote interdependency, where everybody can be a carer and everybody can be cared for. This ethics of care is now very predominant in many societies, with a large influence on the fields of education, medicine, and also museums, where it's raising a lot of questions. So this new methodology of care, which has just been written down, this was done with the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal. It's been published. It looks at the 4 steps of the methodology of care that all of you have already said. So it's identifying a need, then it's conception, the implementation, where the role of mediators is fundamental, and then finally evaluation. And this is essential because it's about identifying whether what we thought would be useful has actually been useful, and potentially if it hasn't been useful, then we're going to need to remedy that. So we talk about co-curation and a made-to-measure program. I've been working a lot on museotherapy. Here we're really in the cure side of it. This is where we're trying to associate the world of museums with the medical world, the research world, academics, clinics, hospitals, etc. And here the idea is to work with our partners so that they can see that museums can contribute to well-being and improving health. So it's about convincing our medical partners that museotherapy is a supportive care. It's a medical approach. We're not talking about alternative medicine here. We're talking about something that can be evidence-based. So within all of this, it's coming from reflection on emotion. This morning, we talked a lot about sensory mediation. It's an important part of emotion, this humanity, which constitutes also our animality at the very heart of this reflection. We're not in practice and artotherapy. Museotherapy is about being faced with an artwork that is going to generate biochemical effects in order to generate hormones and promote well-being. I don't have the medical terminology to talk to you about it, but there is a very useful report that has been used by the World Health Organization from 2009, which does not just talk about museums, but all areas of culture. This is based on a study, and it shows that the role of arts, encountering arts, whether it's theatre or the visual arts, can help heal. So this is the term that I'm using here. We're not just talking about something that is happy, happy feeling. We're actually talking about caring and curing here. This is an approach carried out with a number of different partners. We couldn't work without our partners because if we work in a museum, we're not doctors. We don't have those skills. So we need to invite these skills into the museum like you're doing for a number of other sectors, as we saw today. It's this civil society, this professional society that can come in and stimulate new initiatives and help us to move forward. So this research in co-creation, co-action can lead to a number of different partnerships with protocols. There need to be important surveys carried out in this field as well. There's a question of interdisciplinarity, which is not easy to implement. I'm saying this because there's a real journey to carry out here, even in accepting museotherapy as a supporting care. This has been debated. It's now accepted. But we're here in the field of medicine and science with very precise parameters. So do have an art and health committee with care professionals, people from the governance of your organization as well. That can help. You can also have art therapists, and that can really be excellent. So I wanted just to give some prescriptions. I wanted to talk about prescriptions, which are now becoming more and more widespread. From city to city, I can see a real effort from museums on the ground in their cities that are initiating partnerships with medical centers. So after Montreal, there was Compiègne, Brussels, Montpellier, Lille now, which is starting to launch these prescriptions. I really do encourage you to continue with this best practice. The pandemic has influenced significantly on how we think about the essential need for beauty, a physiological need. And we saw online a number of different initiatives, such as online meditation, virtual museum art therapy, all of this has led to a significant paradigm shift where these approaches to mental health have been discussed a lot in order to help improve the well-being of our societies. And museums have become a real center for mediation here. I'd like to mention the Arthur system here, the Arthur terminal, which helps elderly people to connect online. This has been rolled out in retirement and care homes in France. Finally, some resources that you'll be able to find on the ICOM website. There's some videos, conferences, and some books as well. All of this has been released relatively recently. So there's 2014, L'Art fait du bien, Art does you good. That's a documentary. And a new training program with the École du Louvre. They're now teaching museotherapy. The summer university school in Montreal, which produces certifications as well. And there's a DU from the medical university in Lyon as well. These resources are all available free of charge to you. So the Empathetic Museum is a very useful model for mediation. This is a platform where people can share best practice. You'll be able to find it online. You can see the different markers that help you identify whether your institution is going in the right direction, and also work by the International Committee for Education and Cultural Action. This is incredibly useful. So this has been a very quick overview. I just wanted to show you that there are a lot of resources, and the question of cure comes alongside care. How can we work alongside our society, and how can we provide disruptive solutions and integrate them into our institutions that can sometimes be a bit more conservative? I am now going to talk about resistance and how to overcome some of these obstacles or areas of resistance. I think that we all agree that we need to move forward. I am going to start with Adrien about the fact that we're collecting data that could potentially be seen as a capitalist drive by the museum. How have you succeeded in convincing people to come beyond that fear?
In terms of educating people, I can understand the reticence of people, because like almost all businesses collect data, and we can see on our smartphones with our subscriptions, and people, the businesses know who run those, know what everything that's going on, and we can understand that kind of reticence about us collecting data in museums. But when we do so, it's not for commercial use, and everything depends on the objective. Our goal is to improve the experience of the visitor, to understand what they're doing. We want to try and permanently monitor their behavior in order to do our job better. This morning, someone talked about the presentation around visitor numbers, and they said that when the London National Gallery decided to put in place mandatory reservation, visitor numbers dropped. And you said something to me which connects into what you're saying. Yes, the question was asked during the lockdown, because a lot of national museums started putting in place time slots and reservation and booking, but some refused this because there was a feeling that that would prioritize visitors who are already very present within museums, and it would actually remove us from the visitors that we're looking for, people who are just having a look at the museum and who are much more connected into the uses of the new generation. So we're saying that we haven't got enough young people in museums, even if we've got some encouraging figures that we're seeing. But nevertheless, we're not having a striking success among young people. And I think we really need to be careful about this. I've really seen that I no longer go to the Louvre since there's been that system in place for that booking system in place, whereas I used to pop in. And when I had 20 minutes or something, I used to pop in. Adrien was saying that the new generation is really focused on not so much on consumption, but on accessibility. They want to be able to just respond and act quickly. And yes, in fact, one of the ideas around Mucem Plus is that there's no limit on accessibility anymore. If you've got the subscription on your telephone, you just pass it over the sensor and you're through. In fact, recently I went on the bus. You might be interested to know that. I'm sure you're glad to hear that. And when I got on the bus, I saw that there is this problem. There's this system on the bus that you can pay with your bank card for your ticket directly, because before people used to queue up to buy a ticket, but now you can get on the bus and you can pay with your bank card. Of course, this needs to be regulated, but the more things are fluid, the better the flow is, the more people are going to feel at ease. So yeah, so we can talk about philosophy and the cultural democratization, but of course that involves management tools that are going to make it possible for us to do this. So if I talk to our museum manager friend here who's turned his back on big events and big projects for economic reasons, but you've actually managed to subvert this preeminent model which is in place, and you've been able to prove the efficiency of free entry and this refusal to engage in expensive, long, time-consuming projects. How has this gone down with the municipality? Well, I can't say for the municipality, because actually we are managed by the metropole, the metropolitan area. So this is 46 different municipalities working together. So it's slightly different, and it means my relationship with the local officials is different. So it's really gone very well. But I'd just like to say, it doesn't mean that we're never going to do large-scale exhibitions, but just that we're going to do them well when we do them. But we felt there were other priorities at this time, and we wanted to try another model to that end. I'd just like to say something personally to the translators. I went much too quickly. I'm really very sorry, and thank you for the excellent work that you're doing. So in terms of the local officials, it went really well. Everything went really well, because there's a figure at the bottom in terms of the overall budget of the museum. It was stable. It wasn't going to change. And so they were okay with that. Free entry was backed by 4 different political parties at the municipal elections. I'm really very proud of this, because since the museum's creation in 1940 is the first time that we were listed in a manifesto for a local party. And so the new party, the new president, felt that it was important to integrate our project. The real challenge we had was with the teams, not for free entry, not around free entry, but the fact that we're reducing these large-scale exhibitions. Our my scientific colleagues were really worried about this, but we did it gently. We went down from 2 exhibitions a year to 1, and we went very slowly in that process. And actually, the pandemic really helped us to think about focusing in on what's permanent in the museum. And dear colleagues, I'd really like to encourage you, think about the permanent collections, think about what's happening, because the permanent collections in regional museums like ours are seen by 100% of visitors, because the fact that it's seen by everybody is really very important. And in terms of the description, we worked hard to make sure that visitors come back. And it's a bit like Adrien said, it's just become normal for people to go. I'm in front of the cathedral and I'm waiting for a friend, and they tell me they're going to be half an hour late. Well, I've got 15-20 minutes. I'm just going to pop to the museum and I'm going to see a collection. I'm going to see something in the museum, and then I'll come back and join my friends. Perhaps just to say as well that the tourists and the residents of our region, particularly for the residents, coming with friends and with family is something that's really important, and this is absolutely free of charge. It doesn't cost them anything at all. And that creates a sense of pride among the local population, pride in their local region, pride about their area, and it encourages them to come and to keep coming back, and it helps them to get to know their local area as well. Yes, if I think about the Fine Arts Museum in Rouen, for example, or other museums, the same situation, there is the same situation. So a role that's very important in everything we're doing is given to the security agents and the people, the staff that are on the ground, but there are also, of course, the cultural mediators. We talked about guides. In terms of cultural mediators, how can we make sure that they are able to speak as equals to curators? What are the strategies that we need to put in place to make sure that their voice is heard at the same level as the curators? Yes, that's almost a political question within the governance of museums. We talked briefly about this morning. If we create an audience department within an institution, that gives the institution a strong voice and enables them to be able to speak as equals with curators and the direction and the managers of the institution. We don't only do cultural mediation focused on outside the museum, but also within the museum. So we talked about educational projects, but it's often the same sort of thing with projects focused on audiences within the museum. We often have to explain a lot. We often have to reassure people because there can be concerns about people breaking out of their comfort zone in terms of methods. So we need to focus on education, support, coming alongside people, and also really wanting to sort of put in place an almost political decision to put audiences at the heart of what we're doing. Yes, because as we can see, everyone is in favor of cultural mediation and favor of audiences, but when we are setting the budgets and deciding what we invest in, that's where we can really evaluate our policy and what its real intention is. How can we make sure that in these budgetary decisions that we're making, how can we make sure that the strategies that you've put in place in the different museums that you're working in Lens or elsewhere. Of course, the museums that you're working in have lots of resources, and of course there are others that have smaller budgets. But is it important perhaps to show this political will? Yeah, there are a number of different areas, because working with audiences, mediation work is really important. It requires a lot of human resources. It requires lots of investment in terms of people, and that's something that's really important within museums and institutions in general. Beyond that, there's a kind of culture, just like there's a kind of corporate culture that can develop within museums. There's also a culture of looking for funding and finding funding. So we need to make sure that what we're doing is clearly useful. When we develop a project today that's really well presented, well packaged, clearly focuses on a specific audience and shows all of the learning outcomes that could be expected in terms of the development of individuals, and how that, in a way that could be expected within a cultural institution, you can quite easily get funding or sponsorship around these areas. The whole number of donors who are interested in particular areas, for example, around the responsibility of museums in terms of their audiences. So there really is possibility for funding here. Yes, I think that's really very true. And I think it really requires collaborative work with whole teams. And I think that's really important, because when we're integrating the mediation into what we're doing, it becomes a priority for sponsors who are perhaps less focused on events and more focused on the impacts that they can have on civil society. And that means being able to give account for what we're doing fairly clearly. This means, yes, having our museum buildings, etc., but we also need to be able to create the jobs for these cultural mediators, which is really important for us. Something that we did at a much more modest level, at our level, you saw the figures earlier, is that we went from cultural mediators. So we have 3 staff who work with our visitors, and then we had people that were students who started managing to actually earn a living from like as service providers on a freelance basis. And so people would work at home and prepare a tour. And so what we've done is actually stabilize things since COVID, and we've created actual jobs for cultural mediators. We've made a decision to integrate these roles into our staff and bring people close to audiences. We've wanted to draw people in, and I have said we are no longer going to say shh in the museum, because often wherever we go in museums, Helen has done an incredible work. We really need to let children express themselves. Sometimes that makes a bit of noise, but when they come into a space and they see a work and they start talking about it out loud, it's their emotion that's speaking. And it's wonderful for the future. We really need not to stop them and tell them to be quiet. So I've told all of the staff, you're not allowed to tell the children to be quiet. There are also, in terms of the approaches we've been looking at, we've talked about pilot projects. There's the fact of putting in place these strategies in progressive ways. So there's the pilot project that's in place at the V&A, and then in Mucem Plus, and this laboratory that's there. And then there's also the way of changing your way of working with colleagues. It seems to me that in order to be able to convince our colleagues, who are sometimes a bit reticent And I think it's true, because if we have more people coming to the museum, that means more work for the maintenance staff, etc. So how can we bring in these sort of pilot projects in order to progressively, gently integrate them into our museums? Gautier. For me, I think there's a number of things. First of all, we need to be quite clever, really. I think audiences are interested in museums, and we really need to make sure that everyone's involved. I've experienced this in Paris, where you can go to the workshops, the art workshops in the Louvre, which are just amazing places. There's know-how there, there's skills, there's real professional skill there, real know-how. And so museums can be useful in professional development and in training. So I think when we encourage each person and their role, I think we're wanting to really draw everyone into what we're doing, into cultural mediation. And then at a more general level, in terms of management of institutions, we need to think about the narrative that an institution wants to develop with a particular population, with visitors. And this is a story that comes together over time and makes it possible for us to move forward with our teams. So time is essential, says Nathalie. Well, if I respond to what Gautier said, I tried to force things at the beginning in order to help us to advance, and the institutions are always disrupted by new things. So sometimes we just have to wait until the new thing is institutionalized, and then things go better. But I think in terms of Mucem Plus, I had to push it through a little bit, and that was sort of phase one. Now we're in phase two, and that's starting to be accepted, and people feeling that, okay, yes, that could work. And I think people are now accepting it, but it wasn't necessarily particularly easy at the beginning. So the end justifies the means, apparently, from what I hear. And Philippe, what do you think in terms of recommendation for our colleagues, in terms of the methods for integrating new practices? Well, there is persuasion. So we develop mini events. We invite journalists, Society of Friends, the Museum Friends Association is really important for us. And we profile our cultural mediators. It's not the scientific team that's there, but it's the cultural mediators who are there on the stage. They are introduced, and that works really well. And they're recognized as cultural mediators in their role. And it's remarkable that there is a real diversity in terms of the working times that they have, from 1 hour to a whole day, and we provide cultural mediators for there to be a sort of a discovery tour of at least one room in the museum. So the figures, visitor numbers are not everything, I agree, but nevertheless, dear colleagues, in a pragmatic world with elected officials, with budgets, with figures, with a payroll, which represents for us 74% of our budget, and figures are really important. And then one thing I can just share with you, a little tip, you keep this secret for yourself, but when a business leader says to its 4,300 employees that we've had a brilliant time in the museum, it was magical, and all of the people I invited were delighted, that has much more impact than what I can say, even if I stamp my feet and shout loud. Thank you very much for everything you said. I don't know if we've got any time for any questions. I think we've perhaps run out of time, even though we started slightly late. I'm looking at our president. Well, there is a little bit more time. Thank you to all of you who are on the stage here, and also to Helen, who's with us via Zoom. Thank you for this very rich roundtable. There's been a lot of congratulations and thanks on the chat. So really, thank you very much. And I'd just like to share that with you. I have one question on the chat, which is linked to Mucem Plus. What's its impact in the number of visitors coming to the museum?
Clearly, no. I think that we will need to wait. The subscription system, if we work well and if the teams work well, after a year or two should be scaled up, but we don't have enough perspective or hindsight yet to see what the impact is going to be on classic or traditional ticket sales. It will be interesting to discuss that with the 1 or 2 years of hindsight. Are there any questions in the room? Mr. Kier has raised his hand. Good afternoon. I'm from the Centre Pompidou, Metz, and I've been able to share a lot of experiences with Philippe. I had a question about a topic that we discussed this morning, which is the over attendance of some institutions, so too large visitor numbers. How are you managing new accessibility issues with the visitor numbers that are sometimes over the announced, the planned number, especially with new health measures in place? Allow me to answer this. As we have 1 million visitors every year, we decided to set in place a gauge under the presidency of Laurence Descartes to limit. We had up to 10 million visitors in 2019, and we've tried to limit this at 8 million now. This is one response to this problem, if you want to call it that. And moving forward, the questions that we're having are to think about the concentration of visitors in certain spaces. I'm not going to mention the work that everybody wants to go to see, but the strategy that we're trying to implement is to bring life to all of the Louvre, all of the Palais, across the entire huge Palais, which would be perfectly capable of receiving this number of people. There are a number of options being studied at the moment, perhaps prioritizing education audiences, more fragile audiences that require special support. We are hoping to be able to open up specific timeframes to be able to receive these members of the public. Allow me to stand up. I used to be in charge of digital for all national monuments in France. I don't know if Helen is still online, but I have a question for her. We have not talked a lot about the architectural role. There's museums in shopping centers sometimes in order to helpfully get people into the museum. But we know that there's real meaning, and I would like to get your opinion on the importance of architecture. And the second question, very quickly, allow me to formulate it clearly. We've talked a lot about trial and error and we've all been working in this when we have new models, but there are skills and advances, progress being made. I've been working with a lot of different complex public procurement procedures, etc. If things don't work perfectly, is there not a legal way of saying that museums in specific parts of France, for instance, would like to carry out certain projects? Is there a way that we can facilitate payments? So we've done this at the Monuments Committee with other institutions. I'd love to work about how to be pooling our research in this administrative area. So let's start with our question for Helen.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? You can hear me? Yes, okay. So thank you. It's a very good question. We do know that museums in historic buildings can feel very intimidating to anybody who doesn't have the cultural capital that gives them the confidence and sense of ownership that they can cross the threshold. So we have done a lot of work on something that we call the Welcome Project. And the Welcome Project is both about interventions into spaces that may seem rather intimidating, but it's also about the way that we work as people to welcome our visitors. So, for example, at Young V&A, we have, we call them hosts, like a host at a dinner party. I think it was Charles Eames who said designers are brilliant dinner party hosts because they bring everybody together. And of course, museums are places of convening, public civic spaces where we bring our visitors together. So if you come to Young V&A, you will be welcomed as you enter the museum grounds and as you cross the threshold into the museum. Sometimes you'll be welcomed by me because it's my favourite place to be, but you'll be welcomed by our gallery assistants and our volunteers. And we have different roles for our volunteers: the host, the playmaker, the change maker, the storyteller. And so I know your question was about physical architecture, but of course, going back to my earlier point, museums are about objects, but for people. Actually, the human resource can go a long way to mitigating perhaps some of the other messages that may be given by more traditional architecture. But I also absolutely agree. You gave an example of the museum in other civic spaces, the shopping centre, the museum in the library, the art project in the laundrette. And I think these are also, really, really important. But of course, buildings are nothing without people. Okay.
Thank you so much, Helen. Yes, you mentioned the volunteers, and this is another thing that's very important in human resources between the English-speaking and French-speaking world. So we have the ability to meet additional needs, working closely with associations of volunteers. And this is something that we're really trying to advocate for in order to have volunteers in our museums without threatening employment and employment opportunities for our mediators and our guides. They're going to need the protection for curators as well. Would anybody like to ask a second question? There was a second part of Laure's question. Yes, throughout this project, when we were trying to find a solution like Mucem Plus with micro payments of €3, this is public accounting. It is almost impossible. You've got to add a title for every single €3 payment. For the accountants, it would be a nightmare. So fortunately, there was a decree in France from 2016 for territorial associations, local authorities, so that public institutions can receive payments and then pay them into the public funds at regular intervals. This is done using third parties. The public sector is unable to do this directly. So we've been able to find a solution where we have a company that has designed the application and is also able to manage it. When you pay Mucem Plus, your €3 are actually going to go onto an online payment platform, which is very flexible. And we are working with this third party to coordinate this platform. And this is all set out in the convention. They then pay us all of the money every month. They're not allowed to take a percentage of that. They have to pay us the full amount. And once we have received that, we are able to calculate the cost of their service, which does actually correspond to a percentage. I don't know if that is clear, but with digital systems, we need to work with third-party providers. And fortunately, legislation in France has evolved a lot in recent years, otherwise it wouldn't be possible. Catherine Menet, I have some feedback I'd like to share about a museum in Chalon-sur-Seine, about an extreme situation that I had never encountered before. After the lockdown, we had 80,000 objects in our reserve and 250,000 exhibited with a very small team. We had 8 agents working in the exhibition rooms, and during the lockdown, two lockdowns, we had these 8 agents leave our employment. I knew that when we were reopening, I was not going to be able to have security agents. And so I submitted a proposal to the local authority to not recruit the security agents, security guards. Often, many of them had social difficulties. A lot of them were falling asleep on their chairs, and they didn't really serve much purpose, let's say. So I decided to recruit mediation staff instead. So I completely rewrote the job description into something that was cultural mediation rather than just security. The idea would be that these people could, yes, play the role of security guard in the exhibition room because they had received training on the collections, and they were therefore able to do some cultural mediation as well. 2 years later, it was very conclusive. It was difficult to recruit. We are in a very remote part of France, but we succeeded, and we have now increased the number of people coming back to visit, people coming for the treasures that we have been able to see that and then be taken into other collections. In the terms of the difference between curator and mediator, I think it's quite simple because this micro team has allowed for constant dialogue. So sometimes mediators were not able to answer the questions. So I said, please give me a call in my office where I am in the museum, and I'll give you the answer if I have it. Sometimes I didn't have the answer, but it established dialogue, and very quickly we were able to see that visitors were kind of held by the hand a little bit more. There was a psychological side of this. The visitors were face to face with these mediators. Sometimes they would say, "Oh, I don't need an explanation," but then in the end, they were coming back because they were really enjoying it. I have a colleague in Strasbourg who said that she has duplicated this, and the information plaques, they had extended ones on the basis of feedback from visitors based on their questions. And I decided to draft extended information plaques that really respond to visitor questions or perspective. It's really interesting in this kind of permanent dialogue with visitors to be able to hear them. Visitors have a lot to say when we let them speak. They have a lot to say to us curators, and this small team was able to feed back the visitor perspective. I've not been able to quantify, but I've seen an increase in the number of people visiting, coming back for a second or a third visit. And also a pride to have a museum that is able to respond to questions, and then the pride that these visitors have to be able to bring back their friends, their family. We've become a real family museum. I think this is a really great example, and I think it would be great to see how we could replicate this elsewhere. I have seen it done to have perhaps some security guards at the entrance wearing uniforms, but then within the rooms, there was this double role, which was very active and inclusive. It would definitely be worth exploring this. And it would be great to hear how you were able to transform this role. Thank you very much. I don't know if Emily have another question. I think we're going to need to move on to the next section to keep time. Thank you very much for this roundtable panel discussion. So please just give everybody a round of applause before moving on to our summary session with Laure Armand d'Hérouville.
Good afternoon, everybody. Museums are being transformed, and so the question of new uses is at the center of everything we've been talking about today, and also our professional committee. And it's also at the center of the focus of what we're doing, which will be published in October, and I'm going to be presenting this study now. I have written the part focused on museums, and that's what I'm going to be presenting with you today. I wanted to say thank you to ICOM for the invitation, and also to Mr. Marini, who coordinated this diagnosis project that we've been working on. So what I'm trying to do today is to present this report to you, this diagnostic report, and also summarize this day of study that we've had together. And I also just want to say that it's really been amazing, the discussions that we've had today, and it really does connect into the analysis that we did in the first semester of 2023. And we've looked at museums, but also questions around methods, and the new paradigm focused on revitalizing social responsibility of museums is going to require us to think about the way we work and collaborate and develop our skills. We heard from Christophe Dupin at the beginning of the day that working on our cultural rights, this is a real challenge which is necessary. And this undermines and subverts our way of working in our sector. Then we looked at statistics and foresight work, which sheds a lot of light on uses of museums recognized as such by the users themselves. These are places for sociability, conviviality. You don't just come for consuming culture, as it were. And then there are a whole number of figures about audiences and visitors post-COVID. But we can see, together with a European comparison via the Centimus project, this will give us some interesting analysis, I think. From this morning's session, I pick up sort of 3 key issues around new uses. Works are at the center, but methods for mediation are changing to adapt to our audiences. Helen Jagot said that some objects now need to be explained better, and they need to come together with the personal culture of visitors. But we also need to align with new uses and new expectations. Visitors are looking for a place that has a role of citizenship that is universally accessible. The need to open up to a diversity of voices, like the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Lille with this experience on the information plates, or the creation of collective ecosystem in the Carnavalet Museum. And so we see a change of paradigm in terms of the way that we're working within museums. Now we need to have a strategic thinking, taking into account all professions across museums. And we can see that this is illustrated by the Paris Musée study program. And we also need to take into account the idea of experimenting and failure, which are an acceptable part of developing, as long as we're focused on a long-term improvement rather than just failure that we never review. We also need to think about sharing power and encouraging work in networks with multidisciplinary teams and developing evaluation in order to be able to improve our experiments. And we also need to understand what an evaluation cannot do. This afternoon, I've got 3 more key points, I think, focused on format, which of course is, first of all, the importance of what's done outside museums with these examples from the Musée de la Cour d'Or. It's important to go towards our visitors and even into unusual places like shopping centers. And it's important for us to go with the museum staff. Another factor is that free entry helps to increase visitor numbers, as Philippe Brunella said, but it doesn't work on its own. We have to communicate, we have to improve accessibility, we have to simplify access, and these are key aspects for improving visitor numbers. And it was presented on all of the examples presented. As we think about temporary exhibitions, the Cour d'Or Museum or the Young V&A, this is also something that's very important. We heard a very clear desire to review all professions within museums, security guards, technicians, or cultural mediators. We talked about those, but there are many other roles, of course, that need to be reviewed and integrated into this whole approach. And we need to consider the relationship between different professions, different sectors, and also cultural sectors, including international aspects. It's important to take into account the issues around specific areas. We heard a number of examples from regional museums who talk about their specific situations, whether that was in the provinces outside Paris or in Paris. We also need to think about practices and what museums can contribute to society. Louvre Lens asked us that question, and Mucem was asking us to think about new practices. All of this requires new strategies in order to respond to temporary questions. And then we also need to train professionals in order to respond to the new needs of audiences in terms of participatory work and redevelop teams. It's important to develop internal communication and educate our teams. That's something that we talked about quite a lot. And it's really important to think about how to use administrative rules in order to respond to what the needs of our new audiences. So I'm just going to very quickly present the context of our cultural diagnostic, which is part of the France 2030 plan, which has cultural industries as well as hydrogen and drugs and the whole range of industries. And museums are part of this, even though this was quite a surprise to this. This is a project led by universities and a consortium of the CNAM, the 104, the Métiers d'Art et Design from the University of Panthéon-Sorbonne and others, and works and is based on a great deal of exchange and observation points, such as the Louvre School and other areas where we're developing work at the moment. So we observed 4 key changes. We had a hypothesis at the beginning. We felt there were 4 changes that were 4 transformations that were going on in the cultural sector: the ecological transition, the digital and innovation transformations, changes around spaces, and also diversity in terms of cultural rights and the participation of audiences. We have observed 3 sectors: the visual arts, with a focus on digital arts, museums, and then applied arts or design and art professions. Why do we bring these together? We see that these are sectors that need to work together more and more together, particularly through exhibitions. And if I look at the methodology briefly, we had about 100 interviews and compiled thousands of pages of reports and articles, and we worked with a multidisciplinary team of specialized writers and sought to also develop collective workshops in order to make sure that we produced a coordinated report, not a separate report for 3 different areas. And we came up with 180 different recommendations, which we hope will lead to projects led by the consortium. So first of all, I just wanted to explain that the main thing we were surprised about was the fact that the museum professional sector is poorly understood. There's a lot of literature on museums and their audiences, their visitors. As we heard this morning, there's also data in terms of professional practices, but this is mainly focused on cultural mediation and conservation. The other professions are poorly understood, particularly technical professions. In addition, the information that we have on these professions, they tend to be rather disparate and not up to date. And they often depend on service providers. They are poorly identified, and often temporary contracts are not well identified. So it's very difficult to identify clearly who the professionals of working in museums are, and what skills they have, and what needs to be developed in order to accomplish our projects, and what are the training needs. There's a real challenge in listing the human resources needs. the result is that there's no specific branch within museums. Next slide, please. In addition to what we observed, we saw a number of trends in terms of work within museums, and this led to a number of new definitions. So we had a new definition of museum adopted last year. We've also had a focus on environment, on energy conservation and environmental focus. There's a tension often between these different pressures that are on museums. There's a multidisciplinarity and hybrid approaches between teams and projects. There can be no participatory exhibitions unless we involve mediators from the very beginning. This is not always done everywhere, even though it's something that we're intending to do from what we can hear in our discussions. So the previous slide, thank you. We have an increasing role of external providers taking a role. We can see an increasing role for participation, and this impacts the administrative aspect of our jobs. The link into territorial policy is very important. We've seen that culture is an independent and needs to be independent as a policy sector and not dependent on other policies. And finally, we've saw that around the issues of management and cross-cutting approaches, there needs to be a cross-cutting approach. We talked a lot today about dialogue internally within the museums, but for the moment, there is not enough training around these issues. So I'll just talk very quickly about digital technology. Of course, this is a very important transformation, but this has been in place for a long time for museums that have been innovative in this area for some time, because digital technology is present everywhere in museums, whether it's in the management of collections, ticketing, itineraries, tours, communication, mediation, etc. But generally, it's put in place in a not in a gradual and a progressive way, usually responding to the latest trend, and it's not usually put in place as part of a general strategy. This is, of course, generally true, but it seems to be a general trend across the museums. Digital technology is useful in terms of improving visitor experience before, during, and after the visit on site. This is also something that's important at a cross-cutting level. So it's really important for professionals to be trained in this area so they can take them into account in their current practices. So we've talked a lot about new relationships with audiences, cultural rights, cultural entry fees are now something that is discussed a great deal within museums. We can see that audiences are getting younger, as we heard this morning, but actually the price is the clearest obstacle to visits. So there is a transformation in terms of our audiences, but there is an issue around diversity for our audiences and professionals. We can see, nevertheless, that there is a lot more inclusion and accessibility, and we've talked a lot about this today. Of course, there's a whole number of sensory approaches that can help us to improve our connections with audiences. And for example, Louvre Lens is a remarkable example that is quite inspiring here in this area. Of course, we said, of course, that all museums don't have the same budgets. So all of this means that we are going from audiences who are simply there as viewers and are becoming contributors, because but this is an issue because there needs to be an increase in skill, not just for putting in place projects that are available for audiences to get involved, but also in terms of the strategic decisions that are made. So, for example, there's the University, the Musée de Compagnage in Tours, or the Museum Carnavalet in Paris. This was very clear that we need to see an increase in skills in this area. It's also important to think about participation from ahead of projects and also to have a cross-cutting approach. It cannot just be the audience department or the mediation department that thinks about it. Everyone needs to be involved in this. So we're thinking about the impact of this new report on the understanding of collections linked to decolonization, or impacts of museums that we talked about earlier, or programs where, for example, there's different programs at the Fine Arts Museum in Lille, encouraging people to come during their lunchtimes. We've also talked about new relationships with places. There are new uses because we're increasingly seeing museums as places for life, which are open to local residents. We've heard from Nathalie Bondil about the caring museums, and there was a lot of resources that she gave us there, but this is a new discipline which is still relatively recent, and we need to study this more. A lot of people that hear us talk about caring museums are not necessarily adequately changed and and trained, and don't necessarily have the resources in order to put this in place in their museums. And so sometimes we have practices that can be controversial scientifically, like sophrology, naturopathy, and other areas. We have to think about whether scientific institutions can include these types of things in our practices or not, and whether it's possible to do this in a clear thinking way rather than just following a trend. And then, of course, there's the area of the other areas that are linked in. We have ecology here, and it's important to put in place training in order to continue to move this area forward. It's important to work together with all partners outside the museum as well in order to improve performance in this area. There's an example that we've seen from Metz, which would be really very interesting. We also need to improve skills in terms of cultural engineering by applying this to as many people as possible. And then we need to also think about third places. We can think about the really valuable work that libraries are doing. Sorry, now we're coming to ecology. We were on the wrong slide. So this is something that we've talked about a lot today. This is a cross-cutting trend that impacts everything we've talked about today. Museums can no longer really operate without taking into account ecology. Often museums are talking about it, but often there's not, that it's harder to actually put it into practice and put change into practice. It's a challenge because there is a number of tensions in terms of what needs to be done around ecology. How can we look at conservation? Why do we want to increase visitor numbers when we know that actually the mobility of visitors to museums is one of the strongest factors of a museum's carbon footprint? This is a real question about the methods that we have for supporting this particular transformation, and we need to think about how to adapt to the museum sector. We need to see change in terms of loan systems along international approaches, and we need to make sure that the ecological aspect is taken into account in a systemic approach, which is linked into social and societal issues that museums are linked to.
We have also worked on initial and continuous learning to see whether professionals in French museums were able to come to terms with the changes that I've presented. We have seen today that this question of training has come back multiple times, but there are a number of obstacles to a good professional training system for a number of reasons. There are not necessarily good operators that allow to better observe the sector and ensure fair access to training and the development of skills. We've observed an underuse of training within the sector across all professions. Helen Jagot this morning was talking about difficulty accessing professional training for regional museums in France. In initial training and continuous learning, we need to do more work on awareness raising. The formats are changing and contributing to the better acquisition of knowledge. There are more in situ training programs with immersion, and this is a win-win solution. The example is the V&A Museum, which we saw earlier, where we saw that on the basis of content in the museum, we can actually transform the museum itself. This was valid for the visitor professionals here, and it's also true for other stages. For sandwich courses as well, there are a number of co-design programs developing in order to promote access to the professions of heritage and museums. This is quite important when we're talking about promoting exchange between professors and students. And we have also identified a number of needs for training with freelancers, new graduates, and self-learning is also in place through choice and also because people have to follow that way. There is also an increasing demand for research to play an important role. The training of all professionals is essential, not just for curators, but technicians, exhibitors, managers, etc. We have compiled 180 recommendations that are both cost-cutting and also sector-specific. I would encourage you to read this in detail once our diagnostic document is published, particularly those relevant to museums. To finish, on the basis of these recommendations, a number of training projects are now led by the consortium and different partners. We are, this is especially important, so the training for museum leaders with changes, a cross-cutting training course where people from different professions are able to work together. A training for a technical director for museums. This is a sandwich course. There is no training of this kind at the moment. We see this particularly for those coming from the performing arts sector who would like to work in museums, and then continuous learning for new museum professions and mediation. These projects and others are developing and feeding into discussions and partnerships with you, the professionals, and I do encourage you to contact us if your institution is interested. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, and thank you so much, Laure, for this conclusion. Before you come down from the stage, I wonder if there are any questions before we wrap up our professional day and before we start our General Assembly. Thank you so much, Laure. Oh yes, there is one question. Please do stay on stage. This survey is incredibly interesting because you have influence on our practice. Where will we be able to find the results of this survey? Please be precise. I know that we'll be able to find different elements in the ICOM Acts. For the moment, this has not yet been published. We have submitted it to the Caisse des Dépôts, which gave its approval a few days ago. We are now working on some final touch-ups before publication in October. France 2030, yes. And we will be communicating about that on social media. We will also be creating a website that will be able to hold more data. We hope that we're going to be able to ensure constant monitoring of these issues. Thank you so much. I'm just going to conclude this day. Thank you very much for everybody, all the moderators, all of the team that prepared this program and has contributed one way or another. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for attending this day. We have a short 15-minute break now before the start of the General Assembly. Tomorrow there is a visit planned. There are a few spaces left. There is a list at the back of the hall where you will be able to sign up. The visit to the chateau is full, but there are a number of other things that you can visit. I think there is one space left for the reserves tomorrow morning. So run. The first person there wins. It's outside. Sorry, it's not at the back of the hall. Thank you very much. And our cocktail event at the Musée des Beaux-Arts, Museum of Fine Arts, is 7:30 p.m. Thank you very much and see you all later.